Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women continue to suffer the shameful and devastating impacts of colonisation. From residential schools, missions, child welfare seizures and imprisonment, Indigenous women and girls are vastly overrepresented in state-controlled institutions. Although only comprising 2% of the total adult population, Indigenous Australians represent a staggering 23 to 42% of our prison populations. Overrepresented across every age group, incarceration rates peak between ages 25 to 39. This is also the age group most likely to have dependent children. It is estimated that at least 80% of the Indigenous women in prison are mothers to dependent children. And every year, 1 in 5 children will have at least one parent in prison. While the reasons for the overrepresentation of Indigenous women are complex, the factors that contribute to this are owned both by historical abuse as well as current social and economic disadvantage. There are reported high rates of ongoing domestic violence, child abuse and sexual abuse of women and girls within some communities. The offending profile for Indigenous women is different to that of non-Indigenous. Incarcerated Indigenous women's most serious and prevalent offences include acts intended to cause injury, followed by unlawful entry. For non-Indigenous, the most prevalent offences include those related to drugs and fraud. The high rates of Indigenous women incarceration for acts intended to cause injury have been attributed to several factors, including high rates of substance abuse, high exposure to family violence, and the over-policing of Indigenous communities and populations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are also more likely to return to prison, indicating that once incarcerated, the correctional system is failing to meet the needs of Indigenous women and failing to provide the support required to prevent further incarceration. As a result, 67% of all Indigenous women in prison have been incarcerated previously. Unfortunately, a large number of Australia's Aboriginal people live in low socio-economic areas and have high rates of unemployment. Many live in poverty. A big part of the overrepresentation of Indigenous women can be linked to the racist systems to which Australia privileges whiteness. Punishment is not just the act of somebody imposing a fine, it also represents an expression of power, something that we have always done to Indigenous people. This can be seen within the Australian justice system, which favours non-Indigenous individuals over Indigenous. As a result, Indigenous women are 16 times more likely to be sent to prison. Victimisation is the action of singling someone out for cruel or unjust treatment. Prevalent victimisation has a plethora of effects, including a prevention of empowerment and self-determination. A shift toward the use of crime and punishment as a tool of social control, known as governing through crime, has led to the rise of a risk agenda, which concentrates on the risk of crime occurring, not just of actual crime. As a result, punishment is increasingly directed towards those on the periphery, and no group lies more at the periphery than Indigenous Australians.
For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison, there are various international, federal and state legislation which address their rights. Examples of international legislation which address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in the prison system are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the UN Standard Minimal Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners. Some strengths of international legislation are that there is a large body of international human rights laws that outline standards and practices in the prisons, aimed at protecting prisoners' human rights. Australia has agreed or follows many of these outlines and has enacted some commitments that ensure they are being followed. Alternatively, weaknesses of the legislation include its lack of enforceability, as it only provides a guideline and is not legally binding unless Australia incorporates it into domestic law, and that it does not consider how countries can fund the implementation of these laws.
Federal law pertaining to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison includes the Sex Discrimination Act 1984, the Racial Discrimination Act 1975, and the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Act 1986. Indigenous women prisoners come under these laws as it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and race. However, none of these laws specifically refer to Indigenous women prisoners and their rights, and are not culturally specific.
Each state and territory has different legislation which impact Indigenous women in prison. Mandatory sentencing establishes an exact penalty for each category of offence individually. Western Australia and the Northern Territory both have mandatory sentencing laws, whereas New South Wales and Queensland have mandatory sentencing only in some circumstances. Mandatory sentencing can work short-term in preventing crimes. However, there are multiple weaknesses. It does not consider a person's lived experience, as it takes away the discretion of magistrates to recourse individuals to non-custodial programs and sentences they deem are without risk to society. It does not take a preventative approach in identifying and addressing reasons why crimes occur. Mandatory sentencing is also a large factor in increased incarceration rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. This is because it is a system that leads to disproportional outcomes. This includes imprisonment for stealing a bottle of water, a can of beer, a packet of biscuits, or pencils.
There are a variety of laws and policies which influence the increase in the number of Indigenous women in prison, as well as the conditions they face while they are incarcerated. The entrenched disadvantage is compounded through the escalating impacts that minor offences have when combined with racial stereotypes, assumptions, and discrimination by police. An example is the death of Miss Du, an Aboriginal woman who died within 3 days of being incarcerated for unpaid fines due to inhumane police treatment. Paperless arrest laws are another instance of the entrenched disadvantage of Indigenous persons. These laws were put in place to free police from paperwork and can be triggered by offences including swearing, drinking in public, making too much noise, or having an untidy front yard. Previously, these infractions merited only small on-the-spot fines. Of the 2,000 people who have been detained via paperless arrests, almost 80% are Aboriginal. Despite the various international, federal and state legislation put in place to address the disadvantages which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison face, there is limited evidence that these laws are adequately addressing the issues.
In order to implement services for women in prison, it is essential to understand their needs. Female offenders have been described as a high-needs group, often coming from backgrounds of multiple disadvantage. Some of these problems can include low social and economic status, low education, few employment skills, inadequate housing, substance abuse, and insufficient incomes. Women in prison also tend to have poor physical and mental health, have children, or are pregnant. Sisters Inside is a Queensland-based organisation that provides numerous services to women both in prison and after release. Some of the Sisters Inside services include building on Women's Strengths program, working with women before they are released from prison, providing intensive support to women and their children to overcome the trauma of prison. Kids and Mums camps also focus on the effect of parent-child separation whilst in prison. As a post-release program, these camps aim to unify mothers and children when released. The Health Support Worker program is a personalised program in which women are able to identify their needs and assistance is provided to access the required services. Some of these can include health services such as medical, dental and mental health, drug and alcohol treatment, and social wellbeing such as housing, income, cultural and education support. Work Pathways program helps women return to school, undertake further training and obtain employment in the hopes of breaking the cycle of criminal activity. The Victorian Department of Corrections provides 3 main programs for prisoners spanning the pre-release and post-release periods. There are 7 different areas identified by the Corrections Victoria Reintegration Program that are essential for successful reintegration. These include housing, employment, education and training, independent living skills, mental health, alcohol and drugs, and family and community connectedness. Regroup is a general pre-release service provided to all prisoners 18 months prior to release or upon entry for those with shorter sentences. The aim of Regroup is to identify the needs of prisoners and refer them to these specific services. Relink is a targeted pre-release program run by the Victorian Association for the Care and Settlement of Offenders, which becomes available to eligible offenders 12 months prior to release. This program in particular targets women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners and those serving longer sentences. There are 2 components to the Relink service: the group program that works with groups of prisoners to reach positive behaviour changes influenced by peers, and the practice of positive skills. The individual program builds on any significant transitional needs identified in the group program to produce an individualised transition case plan. Finally, Reconnect is a post-release reintegration service of either targeted support lasting up to 4 weeks or intensive transitional support of up to 12 months. The service is offered to offenders of serious violence or sex offenders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners, women prisoners, and those with high transitional needs. Reconnect is delivered by a number of services including Australian Community Support Organisation, Victorian Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders, and the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Rules Inside is a women's community health network Western Australia service offering pre- and post-release support for women in the prison system. Some of the ways they support women are through transition accommodation, the Re-Entry Link program, life skills groups, Morichiora's Yarning Group, Housing Support Program, and Grief, Loss and Trauma Counselling, all free of charge. A referral to the service can be made by another service, by the woman herself while in prison, or up to 3 months post-release. Overall, there are limited services existing or known about for women, and especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in the prison system. What services do exist, however, do seem to try and address the identified needs of women leaving prison and what has caused them to be there, such as low education, few employment skills, inadequate housing, substance abuse, and mental health issues.
Moving forward in addressing the presenting issues in relation to the high levels of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison, several recommendations have been proposed. The first recommendation seeks to address the culturally biased laws currently in practice in Australia, which impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in contact with the justice system. This could be achieved by reducing the punishment level for small punishable crimes and having culturally informed practice through consulting Indigenous elders on culturally relevant punishments for illegal behaviour. Such consultations may also assist in developing punishments which are more sensitive to the implications of corrective services for Indigenous families and communities. The second recommendation is that legislation should be more focused towards identifying and implementing preventative measures for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. This includes a justice reinvestment, where funds are redistributed from government prison systems to local communities where there is a high concentration of offenders. By redirecting the focus of corrective services in Australia from prisons to local communities, the high rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reoffending may be reduced. The third recommendation calls for the provision of more services for women while in prison, and more support for longer periods of time upon release. This suggests that more targeted programs need to be formed to accommodate for the unique requirements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Risk factors relating to the high levels of unemployment, poverty, and domestic violence underscore the need for improved services and programs in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The final recommendation stresses that one of the most powerful ways to reduce Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prison rates is by empowering communities to help themselves. This standpoint emphasises that if blanket government policies continue to stand in the way of Indigenous peoples' empowerment, leadership and healing in Australia, then incarceration rates will continue to escalate. As such, the role of community consultation and culturally appropriate legislation and services is vital to the reduction of incarceration rates in the Indigenous population in Australia.